Great. I think we're going to get started here. Welcome all of you to the Yale Budget Lab for our discussion of the child tax credit and where it's going in this year's tax negotiations. My name is Dylan Matthews. I'm a reporter at Vox. I've written about taxes for a long time now, going back. I think my first fight was the fiscal cliff in 2010. So CTC has been a major theme ever since then, and we have a really excellent panel to talk about it today. We have the Budget Lab's own John Ricco, who is Associate Director of Policy Analysis, who is one of the people I trust most on what things cost. They're sorting through elasticities, thinking through the numbers here. We have Josh McCabe, who is Director of Social Policy at the Niskanen Center, who knows a lot about the history of this tax credit. There are, believe it or not that many books about the history of the child tax credit, but Josh's is one of them and is really essential background here. And last but certainly not least, we have Megan Curran, who's Director of Policy at the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia. If you haven't been following the Columbia team, they've been sort of following the effects of the CTC and child allowance type policies for many years now. They were very essential in the 2021 ARPA, CTC expansion, and discussions around that. So very eager to talk to her about poverty effects. I imagine this is an audience that knows a lot about the child tax credit, but just to get us all on the same page, I thought I would start with Josh, since you did write the book on the history here. So can you walk us through, and I'm going to hold you to doing this in 3 minutes or so, the history of the CTC starting from 1997 and going, let's go through the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There's obviously more than that, but that gets us to where the policy is now. Where did it come from? What was it meant to do? How has it changed over that time?
Yeah, so the child tax credit, as you mentioned, it's introduced in 1997, and it sort of has this dual lineage. So you had a lot of Republicans who were concerned about rising taxes on families. They wanted to do something to make sure families weren't taxed into poverty. And this was in the Contract with America, Newt Gingrich's favorite congressional Republican plan. You also had this other through line of the National Commission on Children, and Eugene Sterling had proposed colloquially called a fully refundable child tax credit, like a universal CTC, that some Democrats initially picked up on in the 90s. The long story short is the Republican version won out, so we had our first non-refundable child tax credit worth about $500, starting in 1997 into 1998. Over the next 20 or so years, you saw Congress fiddling with this in terms of the amount it was worth, going from 500 to eventually 1,000, and fiddling with some refundability. So initially, it was only helpful if you had some sort of income tax liability. But over the years, you saw compromises that got more refundability, so that even if you didn't have a tax liability and you were making, $20,000 or $10,000, you would get some or all of the credit for those lower income families. So that was for about 20 years, just tinkering with refundability and size. And then 2017 is when Republicans have this trifecta as part of this larger bill. And they go back and do something that hadn't really been done before, is to consolidate it with other family tax benefits. So in 2017, you had the dependent exemption, the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, head of household filing status, and the child independent care credit. There's a lot of overlap there. So what Republicans did was take this exemption for dependents, which usually benefits, it's more beneficial to upper income families than lower income families. And they said this has a lot of overlap. Let's combine this exemption with this larger credit, and we have the $2,000 credit that we have today. So they increase refundability a little bit, but it's still worth $2,000. It's fully phased in when you make low 20s, a little higher for other families. But this was sort of a major break from this past of just tinkering with refundability and the credit amount by consolidating for the first time.
That was somehow less than 3 minutes, which I don't think I've ever gotten from a historian or PhD on a panel. So congratulations. Um, Megan, you've been sort of tracking what the credit has done for poverty since its inception, and maybe we can take the story to 2021 here, which was a big inflection point there. Obviously, the credit was meant to do more than just fight poverty, but can you tell us a bit about what your sort of numbers suggest about its effectiveness, how it changed as we tinkered with refundability, as Josh said, and then sort of the big bang of 2021?
Yeah, so I mean, again, this audience is probably quite familiar with what happened in 2021. We usually talk about it in terms of like three major changes. One, that the credit value overall, the maximum credit, it was increased up to $3,000, which was then available for kids ages 6 to 17. And then there was this extra bump, which made it 3,600 for kids under the age of 6. It became fully available to those with low and moderate incomes who usually were in that phase-in range, or maybe didn't receive any of the credit because of the the historical tie to earnings. And then it also changed the delivery mechanism temporarily, and rather than just getting this as part of your sort of tax filing like in the spring, it actually advanced the credit for half of the year. So between July and December of 2021, families actually saw advanced monthly installment payments, so anywhere between $250 or $300 maximum per child. So all of these things are really different, and I can talk very briefly about, what we saw about the impacts, but I think, one of the biggest things, that happened aside from just the credit increase was obviously this full inclusion of children who were historically left out of the full credit. And I think it's just worth actually tying it back to what Josh was talking about in terms of the evolution over the years. It started off in the late 90s, obviously being like fairly targeted to just sort of like middle income families, lower income families and higher income families, like both didn't receive it. But over time, different changes on both ends of the income distribution included more kids. But what we did always see was that like there was basically never, since the late 90s, never fewer than 1 in 5 children, or 20% of all kids, left out of the full credit because their families didn't earn enough to qualify. So we were always leaving out this huge chunk of kids with, low and moderate incomes who could arguably really benefit from this type of support during childhood. Something like when we got to TCJA, the number of kids left out at the upper income because their families had too much to qualify dropped. It used to be about close to a third of kids didn't qualify because their families earned too much. TCJA, by extending it, actually dropped that down to only 3% of kids didn't qualify because their families earned too much. But it actually increased the amount of kids who were left out from the full benefit with lower income. So it went from in this like 20-something% of kids left out up to about a third of kids were left out of the full benefit because their parents didn't earn enough. And that's basically because what we saw was an increase in the credit amount and not a corresponding substantive enough increase in the refundability piece. So when you get to something like 2021, it's a really big deal to all of a sudden say, actually, we're closing the gap that was leaving all of the kids at the bottom of the income distribution, and saying now all of these kids are fully included. Instead of 1 out of every 3 kids being left out, all of those kids are included. And we're not taking anything away from the folks who already had it. We're just kind of making sure that it's available to almost all kids now. And the combination of that including kids who have historically been left out and the credit increases, Dylan, as you mentioned, led to huge reductions in child poverty compared to prior years. There were a lot of things going on during COVID. There were a lot of other forms of economic relief, but you can still sort of tease out the effects specifically of the child tax credit. And it was doing quite a lot. It was doing, one of the most impactful things for that reduction. And you saw actually child poverty drop to a historic low in 2021 and also get to under 10% in all states, bar California and DC, which were like still slightly higher. So you kind of can't overstate the effects of just sort of like what this one change did in terms of child poverty. We don't usually see that from a single policy, but we also saw a whole host of other effects: hunger rates dropping, families better able to keep up with expenses, and a lot of sort of like economic well-being indicators sort of being moved by this type of policy change.
Got it. Thanks so much, Megan. Okay, so we're caught up. We had this big experiment in 2021. Poverty falls dramatically for children. We revert to status quo ante in 2022, continuing to the present. John, I'm wondering if I can bring you in here to say a little bit about what the sort of evolution of the TCJA model has looked like. You have a new piece of research on this that considers some angles I hadn't really thought of, uh, especially regarding inflation. So, what is it doing for families in 2025? How is that different from what it was doing in 2017? And sort of what should we make of that?
Sure. So, because the TCJA was written to expire at the end of 2025, that means that if Congress does nothing, then the child tax credit will revert to its pre-TCJA form, where it's much lower maximum credit value, and also shrinks the range of families who get it based on income. And to Josh's earlier point, because all of TCJA is expiring, dependent exemptions would come back. And this is where I think the math gets a little interesting, in the sense that back in 2018, dependent exemptions were scheduled to be worth a bit more than $4,000 per child or per dependent. Of course, that's not the tax savings. It's much lower than that because it's a deduction, not a credit. But the key thing to understand there is that dependent exemptions were indexed to inflation, and if they are to come back next year, they'd be worth much more because of that. They'd actually be scheduled to be worth about $5,300. So that's been growing over time, whereas the child tax credit is not indexed for inflation. It's one of the rare provisions in the tax code that is not indexed. And so what this means is that the trade from losing exemptions but gaining a larger CTC was worth more back in 2018 than it is over time, and will be in 2026. In our model, we ran the numbers. We estimate that per child, the trade was worth more than about $500 in today's terms back in 2018. On average, that has shrunk to less than $400. So a decline of more than a quarter. In just an 8-year mark. Of course, part of that is just the unexpected burst of pandemic era inflation. But this is the sort of gist of TCJ's consolidation. By not indexing the credit to inflation, we have the situation where the effects are actually changing and shrinking. The benefits are shrinking for parents over time. I think that's important to keep in mind when they look at potential extension packages.
Got it. And if I remember your report correctly, it would need to be about $2,500 to have kept up with inflation since 2017.
Yeah, that's right.
Got it. All right. So I think we're all on the same page. We know the history a little bit. This is expiring. Congress needs to do something, or the consolidated CTC is going away. Let's talk about where it goes from here. Maybe we could go back to Josh for this, since I think you're more plugged in certainly than I am with sort of congressional Republicans and how sort of right of center folks are thinking about this. What does the Overton window look like here to you? What are the ranges of things that seem possible to do to the CTC at this juncture with this Congress and this president?
Yeah, so for context, we're here to talk about the CTC, but it's in a much, much bigger tax bill, right? So we're all thinking about the CTC. Congressional Republicans are thinking about 199A, they're thinking about rate cuts, they're thinking about the standard deduction, a whole bunch of other things. So it's fighting for space among a whole bunch of other important provisions for a lot of folks. So with that said, I think a lot of it is going to be a bit more incremental, right? So I think there's more interest in doing just straight extension. There's folks there who want to go a bit more in different directions. And I think that includes there's some Republicans with the growing concerns about unauthorized immigration. In 2017, they added a Social Security number requirement for children for the first time. A lot of Republicans now want to add one for parents as well. So this would put it in line with what was done to the EITC in 1996. but is relatively special among tax provisions in requiring a social security number, not just in ITIN. I think there's some interest in finally indexing it. This idea that it has been one of the few provisions that hasn't been indexed over time, and it has been eroded by inflation, which is on a lot of people's minds. So there's some increased attention to indexing it. I think folks are thinking about making up for some of that inflation as well. So potentially increasing their credit to $2,500. That's where it gets a little bit more expensive. So one of the reasons TCJA is a lot cheaper is because that inflation eroded the value over time. Getting that back in this next tax bill, it's going to be a big chunk of money. So we'll see where folks are on that. And then finally, probably phasing in faster in terms of what we saw with Wyden Smith, where you saw per child phase in, maybe lifting the cap of, the first $1,700 are refundable now, maybe making the full $2,000 right away, or $2,500 or whatever it ends up, is something else folks are thinking about. And probably lastly is thinking through young children in particular, right? So there was this recognition in 2021 that taking care of young children is a bit more expensive. There's been a recognition post-Dobbs among a lot of pro-life advocates that we want to put our money where our mouth is and create a culture of life. So some folks are thinking through some sort of baby bonus or newborn credit or some sort of top up for folks with new kids.
Got it. You mentioned Wyden Smith, which seems important to talk about here, since we do kind of have a consensus bipartisan bill that obviously doesn't have universal buy-in, but did sort of lay out some changes. Megan, I wonder if you could sort of walk us through what seems most important in that from a poverty perspective. And I don't know, I think of Wyden Smith as there's all these levers with the CTC that you can pull at in different ways. There's the refundability cap, there's the earnings threshold, there's the rate of, and it messes with all of these in different ways. So can you give us a sort of brief Wyden Smith intro, and then sort of from your perspective as someone who cares a lot about poverty, which of those levers are most important and are the ones to be focused on and thinking about sort of if the CTC can be changed in a way that meaningfully affects poverty?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I think Josh mentioned it a little bit earlier on, but one of the things that is interesting about the way that the credit currently phases in, but that Wyden Smith actually did try and tackle very specifically is, not just the question of like how quickly do you get up to the maximum credit, but actually what does that look like for families across different sizes? Because I think one of the other things that's kind of, sometimes not really at the forefront, because it's not like this is shown on the IRS website when you go to check out the parameters of the CTC. Like this is only something that emerges once you actually map the parameters, as a researcher. And you start to see that actually, it takes close to about $30,000 to get the full maximum credit if you have one child, say you're a joint filer with one child. But the goalposts, like in terms of how much income you actually need to have to get the full credit for each additional child, keeps moving because of the way that, the sort of combination of things that go into the earnings requirement pieces and phase in, and credit amounts sort of interact with one another. And so what you end up having is that, you could have that same family, but if you welcome a second child to your family, you actually all of a sudden need to earn about $35,000. If you have a third child, you need to earn about $40,000. If you have 4 children, you need to earn like well over 45, like getting up close to 48, close to $50,000. This is sort of, goes to the opposite of what actually happens in life, which is that you don't automatically have more money when you have more children. So, and thinking about just like how something that's called the child tax credit would be structured, putting aside the fact that, right now it's not available to all kids or almost all kids, it also is actually making families sort of try and constantly be in like a catch-up thing of earning more to keep getting the full credit for their children. Wyden Smith did try and, tried to address some of this, not by making it the credit like totally refundable by the way that we saw in 2021, but by changing, you can have it, sort of phase in so that families of different sizes actually can start accessing the full amount at the same point in the income distribution. All of these types of things I can sort of, if you're thinking about the spaces between, what we saw in 2021 and what we currently have now, like all of these things make a difference. There was inflation adjustments. There was, eventually, like, Biden Smith would have happened over the course of 2 years, would have, eventually lifted the refundability cap and things like that. But I think, some of the important things to think about in terms of if you're trying to focus on something like poverty reduction is what we've always kind of seen in the modeling that myself and my colleagues at Columbia have here is that, it really does make a difference whether or not you're actually making the full credit available to, all kids in families with low and moderate incomes. You're always going to achieve some sort of fraction, proportionally sort of like less poverty reduction when you sort of make compromises in terms of still tying it to earnings in some sort of way, because you're always going to leave out families that have circumstances that might prevent them from being able to be employed full time. You might have parents with health issues. You might have live in an area where the job market isn't that strong, or you're not able to actually make enough money to hit these minimums. John has some really, and colleagues at the Budget Lab have some really good work that they put out in some recent papers actually showing the sort of income volatility among folks in that phase-in range, that also, when you just look at a point in time thing, which we do a lot when we're looking at poverty estimates, but actually, that the number of folks who actually are in that phase-in range is sort of like less than 30,000 or less than $40,000. Their income is changing year to year. In some years, they might have enough that they get the full credit. Other years, due to family circumstances, say they have a new child, they actually may be out of the workforce temporarily. One of the parents, their income goes down, then their child tax credit goes down. Like, it kind of doesn't make sense from the sort of like common sense, how should a child-focused credit work? But it also then takes a real hit on what it does for family income gains and then for child poverty. So we see the most, sort of child poverty reduction when the full credit available to all the kids. And we also see the sort of most bang for the buck in terms of sort of longer term returns on that as well, when you look at sort of a benefit cost analysis.
Got it. John, maybe we could move to you on this. When you're thinking about sort of changes here, I have like a rough sense that expanding the size of the credit is really expensive relative to other benefits, but changing the way that the phase-in works and refundability is maybe cheaper. How do you think about this? What has the most bang for the buck in terms of changes?
Yeah, your intuition is correct there, where, I think there are basically two categories of CTC changes that are plausible for the coming debate. One is as you said, is the just increasing the maximum value across the board. That is going to be the most expensive, just by definition, right, across the full range of families at basically most incomes and for all child ages. We put that at, I think, about $50 billion per 10 years per $100 increase. And so, to even get back up to $2,500 implied by the inflation adjusted value from 2018, that's $500 billion over 10 years right now. And I don't love tossing around like context-free numbers. I don't think that's so helpful for anyone but, the 10 people who are clued into JCT scores. But, that in and of itself is 10% of the net cost of a sort of full TCJ extension over the budget window. And so, to the extent that these policymakers face fiscal constraints, and they do, if to the extent they're politically imposed or otherwise so, that can get expensive quickly. Now, the way to maybe do something that costs less money is when you get into those targeted changes that Megan discussed a bit, namely the changes in the phase-in structure, whether that's going to a per child phase-in rate that's less than $40 billion over 10, or it's targeting any credit expansion to younger children. Again, just by definition, is going to cost less because young children are a fraction of all children. And I think from a bang for buck perspective, I do think a baby bonus or something similar has a pretty high ROI in the sense that, number one, per, say you wanted to increase the child tax credit for newborns by $1,000, you're talking about not that much in terms of a budgetary impact. And if you wanted to take that same budgetary impact and spread it across all children, well, now that's about $50 or $60, an increase in the maximum value. And that's not nothing, but that's like a rounding error in some families' budgets. Whereas like $1,000 delivered in the first year of a child's life is like a meaningful impact for the finances of many families. I also think from a economic standpoint, and I think Megan's group has done a lot of good work on this. She could probably speak to this more than I can, but like to the extent we have evidence suggesting that cash assistance delivered to low-income families and low-income children has an impact on positive later life outcomes. I think that tends to be more true the sort of earlier the intervention, and so that's an additional kind of pure economic case. And then finally, I would say that on the baby bonus side, I think per dollar, again, of fiscal cost here, any expansion that is geared towards younger children is probably just sort of through statistical correlations going to be more progressive, just because parents of younger children tend to be younger, and younger adults, relative to older parents, tend to make less money, and so that'll just be a bit more progressive. And so, yeah, I view it as like the big across the board changes, and the narrow targeting is kind of the fiscal trade-off scenario.
Got it. Megan, maybe you can speak to that in terms of the sort of potential benefits of a baby bonus versus other things. I think there's the cost element that John mentioned. Just to give some very, very rough numbers, I think there are 3.6 million births a year in the US. You do $1,000 bonus, that's 3.6 billion, assuming perfect take up. And like, that's not nothing, but it's in a federal budget context, it's kind of nothing. So how much benefit do we get here? What do we know about sort of cash early in life?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of literature. Researchers have been looking at the role that cash plays in early childhood for a long time. And then there's been all this really exciting and interesting new research happening recently that ties it to, now we understand more of that, those really earliest years, the impact that it can have on brain development and all of these types of things. So, the science is like pointing, all in the same direction, which is that, cash at this point in time makes a big difference. It also appears to pay dividends over the long term. So we've also, my colleagues at Columbia who do our benefit cost work have shown, they kind of modeled if you had a permanently expanded child tax credit, similar to something like we saw in 2021, where it's available to all kids in low and moderate income families who don't currently receive it. You actually see, huge sort of gains in child health, and particularly that actually, drive a pretty, I think, decent like return on investment. And you would start to see anywhere in between $10 to $15 generated in social benefits for every $1 sort of spent on the program. And this would be annually, once you get to the sort of tipping point, which is maybe it's not that far actually outside of usually like the 10-year window. And then it sort of maintains itself at that very high level of rate of return moving forward. And a lot of that, most of it is generated by those gains in children's health. It's important, for kids, we know that there are higher rates of poverty early in childhood. We've done also some work at Columbia showing that, around the time of birth, the Pregnancy and childbirth can actually be sort of a poverty-inducing event potentially, like if, in the ways that it intersects with health costs, your inability to participate the same way you would in the labor market, all of the costs around having kids. Kids are really sensitive to poverty because, again, conversely, without those resources, all of that development gets affected. And then there's, babies are expensive. There's a lot of like costs associated with it. But I think what's important to maybe point out when we're thinking about the baby bonus type of thing is that first, something like this sort of like really does lend itself to the concept of something being fully available, so fully refundable, taking out the sort of phase in and earnings requirement, because that's exactly the point in time when your income may not be what it usually is, when your income may drop. And so if you're trying to tie it to earnings and have this very, conditional sort of setup, it's but like by nature going to actually sort of leave out a lot of kids or only have their families make it available, and sort of a partial amount. And so you're not actually going to get that extra $1,000 then in your first year of life. You're only going to get some fraction of it. And it's also, useful to think about the way that we deliver it, because, we have evidence now from, what happens when you deliver these tax, payments once a year, what happens when you actually advance them on a more regular basis. We know families use them in different ways, but if you're talking about trying to target specifically money in the first year of life, that timing actually makes a really big difference, right? Because like the clock is ticking as soon as that kid is born. And so right now, you really would actually end up having sort of a calendar inequity. So a baby born at the end of the year, say in December, in theory only has to wait a couple of months for their families that following spring to be able to file their taxes, get the tax return. So they would have, in theory, that baby bonus money available within like the first 3 months of their life. A baby born actually at the start of the year, if they were like a New Year's baby or something like that, actually has to wait. If you think about it, if they're born in January, they have to wait the entire 12 months of that calendar year until the early spring of the following year, which is over a year, to be able to access the once a year tax payment. So already you've actually gone out of that 12-month, first year of life sort of period. You could solve that with actually thinking about regular payments, that when we had sort of, this monthly delivery, that actually makes a lot of sense. If you're trying to think about some sort of baby bonus, you can get it a lot quicker, almost right away. You'd be getting it, in regular installments and so on. But again, that's actually tied, the way that can work or not work, the success of that is actually like whether or not you know what you're able to get. And you only kind of know what you're able to get is if you kind of stop, again, trying to figure out this super complicated formula based on a phase in and what's my income going to be at this point in the year versus this point in the year. If it's actually just like fully refundable from, just like any child up until we hit whatever the phase out rate is eligible for, say the maximum amount, then you're able to easily advance things in equal installments. Parents don't have to worry about having to pay something back or what their income is going to be. And you can actually get the money to the families when they're actually needing it. And you can get it to the babies while they're actually still babies. So a lot of these things, in terms of just thinking of like, what's actually the window of opportunity for a policy that people are interested in, and it's relatively cheap, compared to thinking about doing something for kids all the way up to age 17 or so. Still actually kind of, would be useful to think about in the context of maybe we actually still need to make the credit actually fully available to kids regardless of what their parents' sort of earning situation is, because it's that continuous, conditioning on earnings and employment that's actually ties the program sort of up in knots and actually prevents sometimes, in like the case of a baby bonus, from the benefit maybe being able to get to all the kids that like policymakers are really interested in trying to reach.
Got it. Josh, maybe we can bring you in here about the politics again. My sense is sort of full refundability among Republicans for the CTC as a whole, dead in the water. There was a brief moment where Mitt Romney was slightly curious and he got no co-sponsors, and then he sort of backed away from it. Is a baby bonus different here? is there like less of an assumption that mothers and parents should be sort of in the workforce in the first year of a kid's life among sort of conservatives who are thinking about this?
Yeah, so I think that there's probably two thoughts on this. One is this idea, and you see this with AEI criticisms of getting rid of some sort of phase-in that's impacting returns to work. And the idea is that if it's just a one-time payment, particularly if you expect parents to drop out to have a baby, then you might worry less about folks dropping out of the labor force in response to a fully refundable baby bonus. The other one, though, thinks about it in terms of sort of these symbolic distinctions between working families and welfare families, and this idea that we want to make sure that we're rewarding working families, right? And that's a broad category, and not necessarily giving more cash to welfare families, right? Whether it's because they're undeserving or you think they have access to TANF for other programs, but there's this sort of divide there. So I think there's potentially some opportunities for a fully refundable baby bonus if this was a bipartisan effort, right? You could see some horse trading there, but because with TCJA, it's probably going to be an all Republican bill, that's going to be really tough to do. I do think there is some opportunity to reduce the earnings requirement for something like a baby bonus with this idea that we expect parents, at least partially, to drop out of the labor force when they have a new kid, right? Whether it's unpaid leave or just even if they have paid leave, their earnings are going to drop. So I think how Republicans structure the phase-in is going to be really important here. And to go back to what Megan was saying, if you did a child tax credit top off on the refundable portion, like the earnings requirement's going to be really high, particularly if this is your second or third kid. If you do a CTC top off for the refundable portion, it's going to be a little bit lower, but still significant. If you had some sort of baby bonus that was refundable with a separate phase-in, I think Republicans might be more comfortable if it was something like $10,000 a year. We've seen that in some of the Republican bills for a comprehensive overhaul. But this idea of just some sort of earnings requirement, that the idea that it's going to working families, but you can get that a lot lower than it is now, I think, in this tax bill.
Got it. So I'm monitoring the comments. There's a interesting question here from David Trimmer about implementing sort of raising, since advance payment is difficult through the tax code. Maybe we want to do this separately as a universal thing. I think I've heard the idea of stapling a check to the Social Security card you get for a newborn, and implicitly that would involve the Social Security Administration administering it. I guess this is a question for any of you. What are the pros and cons there? Would that sort of make it harder to integrate a baby bonus with the overall CTC? John, I haven't picked on you in a while. Any thoughts here?
Yeah, I think from a maybe a first principles design perspective, I do, I think as some of our discussion has revealed, I do think that if you were designing a fiscal system from the ground up, you wouldn't necessarily end up where we are, in part because the CTC and the sort of array of benefits that we sort of shove through the tax code are a bit confused in their what the goals they're trying to accomplish. Like they're simultaneously trying to promote what we would call horizontal equity, trying to just adjust fiscal burdens for your family size. They're B, trying to promote progressivity or vertical equity or poverty reduction in some cases. That's that sort of dimension. And then C, they're also trying to promote work in some cases. And like these are in tension in some way. And I think the fact that we have ended up in a situation where these are delivered to the tax code for historical reasons. I think Josh should probably speak to that historically and the politics of it. But it does lead to these awkward situations where, yes, you are going to face administrative challenges simply because the existing infrastructure is done on the tax side, and that's just not the optimal place to do it. But we have to do it that way because we're thinking incrementally. So yeah.
Another question from the Q&A from Josh's colleague Leah Sargent that I think is interesting is how this sort of interacts with our benefits for childless people. And I think she's asking a question about sort of the idea that the CTC represents a benefit for parents as opposed to non-parents. But I think there's a related question where the childless EITC is quite stingy. I think it's generally acknowledged that the welfare state or the safety net for people without children is weaker in a lot of ways. Megan, how do you think about, are these just sort of different conversations, or how has this sort of affected CTC politics in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually like, it's been top of mind in our group because actually just last week we released a paper looking at what would be the income and poverty effects if you expanded the childless EITC. You know, again, we saw a temporary expansion of this in 2021, but again, historically, that's been something where not only is the benefit much smaller, you know, it's only about $500 maximum for you know, a worker on a low wage without dependents that they're able to claim. But we also see a lot of exclusions, you know, like younger workers, 18 to 24-year-olds are not included. Older workers, age 65 and over, are not included. You know, so there's a lot of sort of issues there. And in parallel, we've also done, you know, some recent work looking. Some of my colleagues who work on our historical poverty measurement have looked at specifically the historical poverty rates of young adults, you know, so if you go back to the 1960s to now, and you can see that those are actually sort of elevated and much more sort of, you know, staying high over time compared to a lot of other groups that you've seen historically, their poverty has dropped because of taxes and transfers and things over time. But young adults tend to be left out of a lot of programs, like you were saying. I mean, they are, you know, they're related in that, you know, everyone is still sort of people in society, and the young people end up, you know, potentially becoming parents at some point. But also, you know, there's people who might argue that it might be a lot harder for people to think about, you know, starting a family in their sort of like ideal, like, you know, scenario if they actually don't have enough money to do so comfortably. And so, you know, all of these things like are tied together ultimately. But I think, you know, there, of course, and I know that, you know, some of my other panelists here have thought a lot about and written about, you know, the ideas of sort of, you know, EITC and CTC sort of combinations where you separate out the kind of work piece a little bit more from what the child piece would be. And I think all of those are really important conversations, because I actually, you know, sort of just in terms of studying children and child poverty and things like that, I think there's a real case to be made for actually not conditioning sort of child-related benefits on parental employment and earnings. Because I mean, if it's supposed to be about the children, then these are things that children can't control what circumstances their sort of family is in, or what may happen year to year. But I think if we're thinking about trying to do it technically speaking, then it's always just like trying to make sure that, you know, we don't end up in a situation where some of the children and families who are already sort of in the economically sort of vulnerable cases end up sort of losing out. That, you know, even though we do have this kind of like piecemeal patchwork system that's built on each other, which I think we can all agree, like none of us would have designed it like this if we had had the ability to start from scratch. It's still one of those things that you always just want to be careful when you're trying to like take out some of those pieces, because it's like a Jenga thing, in that like you want to make sure then that for, you know, some kids who may be getting support from different places, that the sort of new version doesn't actually cancel out some of their things. They're left either, you know, worse off, or even sometimes held harmless isn't necessarily always good enough. If you're saying like, well, children in some families might actually like see gains from like this type of reform, and other children like may see like not really that much at all. So it's happy to talk in more specifics. That's kind of in generalities, but I think, you know, the things are related, but it's also sort of requires just thinking through.
For sure. Maybe this is a point where I can bring in Josh, since I know you and Leah have been doing some exercises trying to think through how you would consolidate family tax benefits. And it does feel a bit like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube where you fix one side and you screw up another side. So what have you found, and like what seems promising there?
Yeah, I said, no one would invent this, but I put on my sociologist hat, and like you go to war with the army you have, not the one you want. So we have this sort of kludocracy of different benefits. And I think that's where most people get hung up is we all agree here's what it should ultimately look like, but there's little agreement on how to get there from here, right? So we saw last week that Democrats proposed an expansion of the child tax credit, but also an expansion of the childless EITC. Um, Lots to come into that, but there's also concerns that when you do it that way, you're increasing marriage penalties. It's wildly expensive. There's all these sorts of downsides. And then on the Republican side, you see something like a Blake Moore bill where they just take everything and mush it into one big child benefit and one big worker benefit. But again, in those cases, some families are going to be left worse off. There's going to be some issues where it's still not going to lowest income families. So right now we have these two streams, and what we've been trying to do is figure out how to get there from here in more incremental ways. So we're excited to see those big bang ones. But as Megan said, right, there's going to be some trade-offs. So in the report me and Leah have, we separate some of the EITC child credit over to the child tax credit, but most of the cost of that, most of the benefits from that are going to middle income families, right? And that's sort of a trade-off that we make there. And if your main concern is child poverty and getting more for low income families right here, right now, that's going to be not an acceptable trade-off. So it's going to take, I think, a lot of discussions of what are the different paths to get a sort of cleaner tax system that works for workers and for families. But we're trying to start that conversation now.
Got it. Um, One question I think is kind of for all of you, and so whoever wants it, jump on it. Is White and Smith still relevant at this point? I think one thing I've been thinking about is that that came at a moment where it was paid for by this change in the specific tax credit. It was a pot of money that seems like it doesn't really exist anymore. It was reduced the deficit versus a baseline of like you were doing it in 2024, so the TCJA was going to last until this year anyway. Um, and now we're considering those ideas in a context where, I mean, maybe the Senate Budget Committee disagrees, but you in theory have to pay for stuff. You're considering it with the TCJA as a totality. You don't have the employee retention credit pot of money to play with. Is that still sort of a relevant thing to be looking at, or should we be sort of be junking it and starting fresh? So yeah, I don't have a specific person in mind here. I will call on someone if there's too long a wait, but
Yeah, I'll say, and this sort of goes to some of John's research on the erosion of the child tax credit. I think some of the trepidation we saw with Senator Crapo last time around was really what John was talking about, where if you look at the refundable portion of the credit, that was indexed, right? So lower income families have been slowly keeping more of the credit, versus middle income families were the ones losing out. And if you think of it from that perspective, something like Senator Crapo's reaction to Wyden Smith make a whole lot of sense. That we want to make sure we're including middle income families in any changes that we make. On the flip side, there was a lot of progressive energy behind the per child phase in, mostly because it gets more money to lower income families. I think that's less relevant now that we have a Republican bill, but there was a whole lot of pro-life advocates who saw this as a way to make sure that folks faced with a decision whether or not to have an abortion typically lower income families might be doing it for economic reasons, that you're gonna make sure those families feel like they have something to support them if they choose to have the baby. So there's that element in there that's still at play. But it's TBD of whether that's enough to sort of push the caucus toward including it in TCJA 2.0.
I
Got
mean,
it.
I could just jump in real quick and say, I don't, I obviously I don't know the ins and outs of like behind the scenes discussions and things like that, but it also just does kind of seem that, from the headlines, we see lots of different scenarios sort of playing out like in any given week. Some weeks it feels like conversations are around there's a question of whether or not even the TCJA or CTC will be continued. Then it's just a straight up sort of TCJA extension. Maybe there's a slight adjustment to cover the erosion. And then, I think it was actually just a few days ago, there's a headline saying that actually maybe there might be some room to do more, including with refundability, and maybe actually would also include a conversation about the top rates and things like that. And this is from sort of Senate Republicans. And then, we did have the context actually just not that long ago of during the presidential campaign, now Vice President Vance actually giving remarks talking about a large child tax credit, $5,000 per child, and available to all kids. So, and obviously, all of, it, again, I'm not there behind closed doors, but it appears obviously that he, has a real voice in this administration. I don't know, like, to what extent, all of these different things will get hashed out in terms of sort of, again, the sort of competing demands in a larger bill. But it does sort of just feel on the face of it that, like, even though we can probably identify things that seem like they're more within the realm of possibility, at the end of the day, like, it doesn't, seem totally clear that, like, we 100% know. And there are all of these things that I mentioned have all been things from different folks in the Republican caucus, rather than, putting a pin in sort of what Democrats may have been proposing. And, there's, I think also just, thinking about the TCJA discussions, a lot of people have been preparing for this for years because we always knew that there was a timeline, right? Like 2025 was going to be a massive tax debate year. But now that we're actually in it, it's also, important to like just take stock of what the moment is that we're sitting in when the tax debate is happening. And, it's very likely just from the recent budget resolutions that, whatever happens on the tax piece is also going to be part of a larger reconciliation effort that is going to potentially have, significant cuts in Medicaid and SNAP, just as starters. And also there's, a lot of disruptions happening in federal departments and agencies that also administer programs that hit families' finances directly, childcare, things like utilities, energy assistance through LIHEAP. All of these things are kind of all happening in the same time. And so it just makes it also maybe feel like if we can't quite predict what's happening, it's also interesting to just make sure we're kind of thinking about, if there's incremental changes to the child tax credit, or if there are bigger ones, how does that also sort of, sit with families in the context of when they may also be worried about, their healthcare or just what prices may be, like in terms of buying their essentials at the store. And it's kind of just trying to think, like, with the child tax credit in sort of more, small change formats, like, is that sort of meeting the moment of like what's happening for families? And like, I don't have any control over those discussions, but it's just something that I've just really been thinking about a lot lately because, you know, all of these things happen in sort of different committees and things like that in different agencies, but they're all have the cumulative effect of the same sort of family and the same family finances.
I want to return to that. One quick question from the Q&A for Josh, just to clarify what Crapo's objection was on White and Smith, because there was some indexing of the maximum benefit. So could you, yeah, just brief clarification there, and then we'll move to our last.
Yeah, I saw that. Just to clarify, what I meant was the erosion from inflation up to that point had mainly hit middle and upper income families. So it indexed it at that moment, but you still have it. It's, you know, the 2000 is worth less during White and Crapo time than it was prior years.
Got it. So I think the last thing is something Megan mentioned here, and so John or Josh would love your thoughts. We're having this conversation at a time when a lot of things are happening, and I suppose that's always been true for the CTC. I mean, it was created shortly before the Lewinsky scandal broke, then it was expanded shortly before 9/11, then it was expanded in the Great Recession, and then during COVID. Like, there's a sense of emergency that seems to haunt it. But given things that are happening with tariffs and broader challenges to the safety net, sort of, what does that indicate about where we should push this? Maybe I'll point to John, but yeah, Josh and Megan, if you have thoughts after.
Yeah, my one contribution here would be to say that to the extent that the trade war tariff front, which creates economic costs, and to the extent that those costs get resolved as higher prices, if the Fed sort of structures the macroeconomy in that way, then I think the demands for indexation will maybe be more top of mind given, continued rising prices.
Yeah, very much a pocketbook politics story, whether it's inflation or tariffs. Families feel this, and policymakers usually have a need to respond to it. And the child tax credit has historically been a very good way for policymakers to do that.
Wonderful. We're a minute before time. So unless anyone has a particularly brilliant closing remark to put a pin on all of this, I think I might end it here and give people back a minute. But thank you so much to Megan, Josh, John, to Martha and Silva and the team at the Budget Lab for setting this up. And thank you all for attending.